have everyone here for our final session of the day. No need for the bell, we had Craig. So this is a really special conversation because this year, Virtues and Vocations decided we would start an annual book prize with a recent manuscript, and our editorial board for Virtues and Vocations, the magazine, selected Norman Wirzba's Loves Braided Dance. And so this is our first opportunity to share our book prize, but also to have a conversation with Norman. So what's going to happen is we'll have a conversation for about 45 minutes. I promised I would ask him really hard, challenging, stumping questions. He's ready. And then we have a set of folks from the professions who we've asked to give 60 to 90-second responses from their profession. Brian Antiel up front has prepared something magnificent, I know. But we also have Jess McManus-Warnell up front here. We have Nancy Lake somewhere. Hey, Nancy. And then, ooh, I'm blanking on the last person. Who are you? Karen Boland. Oh, way in the back. So as we conclude the conversation, runners with a mic will come to you and you can share your 60 to 90 second reflection, again, from the perspective of your discipline. So with that, I just want to jump in. For our monthly newsletter, I reviewed Norman's book. And so this is a really important disqualifier. So I love everything Norman writes. So he is a professor of theology, check is in the mail. He's a professor of theology at Duke Divinity, has written several books, and they tend to be super accessible. He's a beautiful, beautiful writer that makes you feel when you read his work. And more than that, it really inspires you to reflect on yourself, reflect on the world, and how you can contribute to the making of a better world. And from the minute I saw this book was out, I just had to get my hands on it. And so like all of his work, I'm biased, I love it. That said, enough of the qualification. Can you just jump in and tell us this notion of Love's Braided Dance? Where does this come from? What are you referring to? What does it mean?
Okay, I mean, first I have to say thank you. That was so kind of you to say, and having heard about so many good books today already, it's really a bit humbling to have done this. So anyway, Love's Braided Dance. So I hang out with young people. I have 4 young adult children, and what I hear from them is they're not interested in hope. In fact, they're deeply suspicious of hope. And that was a bit of a shocker to me. But then when I started hearing them say they're not going to have children, that really set me back. Because I started to think about what is the future for a culture if people are saying we're not having children because we can't imagine bringing children into the world that we're in. So I thought, hope is, at least in my view, one of these elemental terms that seem pretty important not to lose in our vocabularies. And so I wanted to think, what's wrong with the way hope has been framed, how it's been maybe even modeled? And I realized that I was deeply suspicious of a variant of hope that people often go to, which is optimism. And that optimism, in fact, is a pretty cynical way to live, because optimism says, just don't worry, it's going to be okay, somehow. Because the systems that we're in right now, there might be some problems along the way, but they'll work themselves out. And I don't believe the systems are okay. So that didn't seem to be a very viable way to proceed. And then as I started to reflect a bit more upon the people who I've been inspired by, who live in ways that cause me to want to hope, I found that these are people who are fundamentally in love with the world, with the community, with other people, and they commit themselves to loving them. And that's a radically different way of framing hope, because love is inherently a vulnerable reality. Right? I have kids. I now have 2 grandkids. I'll show you pictures if you want to come see. And I love them dearly. But as you know, you have no idea what's going to happen. You have no idea if they'll love you back 25 years from now or 13 years from now. You just don't know. But that doesn't mean you don't love them. And hope is like that. Hope moves in the what I call optative mood, if only, things could be a certain sort of way. And it's also an inherently humble gesture. And I think what I saw young people looking at, especially people like me, is that there's been a history of arrogance amongst people thinking that they can predict the world, shape the world, and that it's going to be good for everybody. And so love became the primary thing for me to try to get on the table, because I think of hope as being love in the future tense, something like that.
I like that. We heard Andy talked about hope as a verb, and I've heard you talk about that notion as well. Can you talk a little bit about loving as a verb and hoping, right?
Yeah.
Those activities, actions,
right.
Doings.
Yeah, so, when I go talk around the country, I'm usually talking about very, very depressing things, right? Climate change is a big one that I get asked to talk about, or just more generally food systems, agriculture. And you have a litany of bad things that are happening. You can also talk about political, social realities, inequality of wealth, polarization, all sorts of things. And at the end of Q&A time, people would always say, okay, do you have hope? And I thought, oh, I don't like that question, because it makes hope sound like something that you have. It's like something like a security blanket or maybe even a vaccine. And if you've got it, good for you, because somehow now you're shielded. And I don't subscribe to that way of thinking about it. It's not something that you have. And so by the end of several of these kinds of things where people say, do you have hope? I would say, I don't like that question. The better question is, what do you love? Who do you love? And then, what will you do about it? And so the action is always going to be particular to the very specific situation that you happen to be in. So in my case, I'm a father, I'm a grandfather, I'm a teacher, I'm a neighbor. I've got a variety of roles that I play in my day-to-day life. And so I have to constantly be asking, and I'm not always very good at this, is what could I do to exercise love here so that our neighborhood is better, or the classroom environment is better? And so to start whatever encounter I'm anticipating by saying, what would it mean, what would it require of me to learn how to love better in a situation like this, that's a fundamental shift in the modes of behaving. And it's not always easily done, because sometimes what I think would be the loving thing to do is not exactly the loving thing to do, because love is not immune to being distorted and degraded and twisted in such a way as someone coming up to you and say, I just want to love you. If someone did that to me, I kind of want to run away, because I don't know what that means. I mean, it could be a rather aggressive way of trying to control or dominate. And so it's always important when talking about what does love require in a situation, that it not be unilaterally decided or even acted on, but that it's something that we do in deliberation with others about what could love look like here. And so that's a discernment process. It takes judgment, takes time, and those are not always available.
So you frequently talk about the challenges in climate. Those aren't upbeat, hopeful conversations. Oftentimes engaging young people. When you ask the question, what does love require? I'm thinking of my own young people, and if I said that to my children or to other young people that I'm close to, I can imagine them kind of looking at me and being like, okay, weirdo and walking away.
Yeah.
Ray, how do you articulate that? Like, what's the next sentence?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Suzanne. I think the danger is that we might sentimentalize or romanticize what love is. And I want to resist that. And this is, I think, one of the reasons in the book I describe a lot of grim things. And in fact, friends who were reading it as I was writing the chapters said, Norm, you gotta get to hope quicker. Because there's some really rough stuff you're talking about there, right? I mean, and it is, it's just some horror that's going on in the world. But it was important for me not to discount that, precisely because young people, they're really good at sniffing out hypocrisy or sort of distorting the reality that they know to be real. So that's one thing, is to not minimize or try to hide the pain, the suffering, the violation, the injustice. And that's important to always have in view. Another thing that was important for me to do in the book was to really emphasize the importance of forgiveness. Desiring forgiveness, but also granting forgiveness. Because so often when we try to love, we do it badly. And creating times in which people can say, that was really badly done. That's really important to do, and man, is that hard. Because, when I think I'm trying to be a loving person, in whatever context, for someone to say, man, you have messed it up, that's almost devastating to have to hear. Because we want to think that love is good. And in so many instances, it is good. But when you know how much and how easily love is abused, you have to constantly be prepared for someone to come to say, that's not been a good thing. And so when I'm trying to think about love, I'm trying to think about something that's very participatory, that's open to listening, that is slow moving, that is constantly open to revision, that's constantly accounting for mistakes. Those are all going to be vital elements in any of the action that we're going to try to perform. Because the things that we're facing that are causing so much hopelessness and despair, they're enormous, they're complicated, and we have to be willing to be taught all the time. And often taught from people that we don't think we need to listen to. And here I'm thinking especially of very young people who come with tremendous concern about what they see to be a future of greatly diminished prospects. And to listen to young people say, your generation screwed it up for me. That's wrong. But it needs to be said. It needs to be heard. And then we say, what can we maybe do together?
Can you give an example of a moment where you've had that particular conversation?
I think I would say with my children. I mean, one of the joys of being a parent is you see your kids get older, right? And they become their own person. And you see that they have really good ideas. And oftentimes those good ideas are not your ideas. And so, when you have kids like I do, I have 4, 2 girls, 2 boys, they've got a wide array of friends. And their friends have positions that I don't think, I'm not so sure I want to go down that road. And then the kids will tell me, what's wrong with you? Why are you wanting to restrict love to certain segments or certain kinds of people? And so for me to have to learn from them about how I have just been sociologically attuned to thinking about situations, people in particular sorts of ways, has been a painful education. And sometimes I'll want to push back, but it's really instructive to have to listen and to say, I was wrong about that. And, the temptation to say, that was just a game between parents and kids. It's not. It's actually a really profound moment when the friendship that you can have with your kids becomes transformative. And transformation is hardly ever easy. It's often very painful.
When you think of sort of love, you're describing sort of this shared commitment. And it's a shared commitment to a relationship, but it's also to the broader world in many ways. Can you talk about why a love and commitment is connected to hope, and maybe using an example from the book, because I think there are so many really good examples of what that looks like.
Yes, I mean, one of the things I wanted to do in the book is talk about how hope happens in a world that is a world, a physical, material world, and that means land, it means plants, it means creatures. And so I'll just tell briefly a story. I was at a conference in central Alberta. I'm from Alberta, I was a farm boy, and I had been away for many, many years, got invited to a conference called Spirit of the Land. And it was with farmers and First Nations people and then some academics. And some amazing sessions were happening, and this older couple comes up to me, Don and Marie Ruzika. And they say, "Can we have lunch with you? We have to talk to you about something." I said, "Sure." So we met for lunch, and Don says, "I need to tell you about how the land forgave me." I said, "What?" He said, "Yeah, the land forgave me." And I thought, this is going to be a good story, because we don't think about land forgiving us, because that's between people, right? Those are the relationships in which something like forgiveness can happen. But I should have known better, because I've been working with agricultural people and agricultural traditions for a long time, and it's very clear to agricultural people, if they're not just industrialists, that the relationship they have with land is a moral one. So Don describes how his family, and this is in many ways a mirror of my own family farming tradition, where they had settled in Western Canada. It was obviously First Nations land. Treaties were badly written up to displace First Nations people. But his family wasn't involved in removal of these people. They came because they were promised agricultural land. They could start a new life. They were coming from Central Europe, like my family was going to do a generation later. And they built up a farm. And it was a successful farm. It was doing really good things. It was growing good crops. It was growing meat. And then in the 1980s, roughly, an uncle was going to get out of the farm and asked Don if he wanted to buy it, take it over. He did. And the 80s really started in the 70s already. The 80s was a time of real accelerated industrialization of agriculture, which meant everything focused on increasing yield. And that meant sloughs, forests, swamps, everything was just eliminated so that you could put as much acreage into cultivation as possible. And you no longer had pastures. You cut down any of the fence rows, windrows, and it worked for a while. But what Don says, that it amounted to a tremendous debt load, because to buy all the equipment to do this is hugely expensive. And he said what he noticed is that his whole way of being had changed, where everything was driven by a monetary pressure. And at the same time as that monetary pressure was weighing on him physically, right, he was developing serious gastrointestinal troubles. At the very same time, he was killing his land. Birds were disappearing. Mammals were disappearing. Insects were disappearing. Butterfly, bees. And you remember going to the doctor, and the doctor said, "You're going to die soon because you're totally wrecking your body." And when he heard the doctor say that, he said, "I also heard him say, you're killing your land, because all the life that you've known is to just being drained away." So Don came home, told Marie, his wife, and they said, "We got three choices. We can either keep doing what we're doing, we can quit and walk away, or we can do something different." He goes to the mailbox in town to get the mail. There's a flyer sitting there saying, "Do you want to get off the agricultural treadmill?" And he's thinking, how does this happen? He goes to take this workshop and starts learning about regenerative ag. So he starts to learn from wetland ecologists. He goes to extension agents. He goes to plant specialists who are going to help him figure out what are native species. He starts talking to First Nations elders. And he starts to heal the land by planting tens of thousands of trees and shrubs. And he says slowly the land is coming back to life. He decides he's going to open up sloughs and wetlands and plant trees and forestry again. And he says one morning, he says, I remembered exactly, it was 6 a.m. He was moving his pasture poultry across the field, and he heard a meadowlark. And he said, I hadn't heard a meadowlark in 10 years. I think it's the most beautiful sound there is on the prairie. And he said, I'm thinking, this must be a trick. I didn't really hear a meadowlark. And then he said, the meadowlark sang again. And he said he fell to the ground weeping. And I said, why? And he says, because the meadowlark said, I forgive you. I said, wow, can you say more? And he says, well, I don't exactly know how to say it. He says, but it was not a cognitive thing, it was a visceral thing. And he says, the best I can make sense of is when the birds sang to me, it said, you have enabled me to come back home. You have wrecked my life and the life of fellow creatures, but you've made our place hospitable again. And he says, that's why I cried. And he says it was the confirmation that his effort to reintroduce diversity, to reintroduce agricultural practices that heal the land, that build soil fertility, was the right thing to do. And he says, you know, it's not been perfect. Right? There's still plenty of creatures that have not come back. But he says coyotes have come back. Right? All sorts of mammals, insects, they've all come back. And he said, that is a realization about how forgiveness is not simply a feeling, it's not a one-off, it's a way of constantly starting in the morning, asking, what have I broken? What can I heal? How can I celebrate the life that's here? And he says he would like to start a group called Industrial Farmers Anonymous or something like that, where farmers can come and confess about the things that they know they've done wrong, so they can figure out what would it mean to try to do it right. So I put that story in there partly because I think it's just such a powerful story about how hope depends upon us learning not just to love each other, as important as that is, and I talk a lot about that, but how important it is that we learn to love land and fellow creatures. Because it's a delusion to think that we can live well on land that has been thoroughly poisoned, or with creatures that have been either extinguished or severely harmed.
It's really an extraordinary narrative, and as you were telling it, I kind of was thinking about the deliberativeness at which you approach this. And as we think about cultivating character, especially amongst young people, students, professionals, is love something you need to practice? And so that's the first part. And the second part is, so much of your book is about embodiment of virtue. And if you could talk a little bit about those two pieces.
Yeah, so one of the chapters is called Resonant Hope. And it's about how, the basic assumption is that people are feeling incredibly lonely in the midst of a more connected world than we've ever seen before. And the question is, what's going on here? That we can feel that we're connected through social media platforms and various forms of technology, but people are still feeling so terribly lonely. And what really helped me in this is the work of a sociologist named Hartmut Rosa, who wrote a book called Resonance. It's a big book. It's astoundingly good and can help you rethink so many, many things. And what he does in that book is he describes how resonance, which is this acoustical phenomenon, which I think you all know about, right? You take a tuning fork and get it vibrating, having another tuning fork right next to it, it'll just start vibrating responsibly, responsively to that other tuning fork. And he says that's what your body is. Your body is a resonant organism. And that means that your body doesn't simply want to be stimulated. Your body wants to be transformed. And that's a transformation that happens cognitive, emotionally, but also physiologically. And there are plenty of examples that we could give to describe how that actually works. You've all experienced this, I'm assuming, right? If any of you have ever fallen in love, what's going on in your body? It's not just that you have cognitive assent saying, oh, I think I like that person, right? Your whole posture changes. Or if you're listening to music and suddenly you're weeping, or you're tapping your foot, or you want to dance, right? These are physiological responses. And these are so important because we're living in a context where the stimulation is everywhere. In fact, you could say we're being assaulted by stimulation in our world. And what we're missing is the real transformation that can happen that repositions and reorients us in the world. And the thing that is a practice in this is it takes time. It takes a capacity for attention and listening that are so difficult to come by. We can be listening to music, but not listening to it. Right? We're hearing it, but we're not listening. Or we're looking, but we're not really seeing. And so time is absolutely crucial in this. And so for character formation to happen, I think one of the most important things we can do in our places is to simply slow it down. And say to a student, say, you know, I got more than 5 minutes. Let's just sit for a while. Or a colleague, or whatever. I mean, it's going to be different in all sorts of contexts, I know. But the first step, I think, is figuring out how do we come into the presence of each other so that we're not trying to just be a controlling presence or a maximizing presence, right? Because we're addicted to maximization, optimization of any opportunity that comes our way. And I remember listening to this one Danish psychologist who decided that he wanted to do some work around what does listening require. And he said, I learned pretty quickly because I'm in an academic environment, and I know I am so guilty of this. Someone will be talking to me and I'll be like this, and I'm nodding, and I'm thinking, when are they going to stop talking? Because I need to respond. That's not listening. So he said, what you need to do actually is take a vow of silence. So to be in the presence of somebody who's talking, and you already have said, I'm not going to respond, I'm just going to listen. And he says, you do that, and it transforms the listening experience because you're positioning yourself now not as the one who has to give answer, or has to correct, or has to show wittiness, or whatever. You're showing yourself as someone open and available to them, knowing that they might say something, and on their own they will say, I don't think I said that right. Can I try it again? And you give them the space to do that. And so creating those spaces, they take skill, they take practice, and I think above all, they just take time. And that's the struggle for me. And you got a phone, you don't have time. Because you're constantly being asked, solicited, and when you're living in a solicitation reaction mode, you're never really anywhere. Right? The sociologist, anthropologist Marc Augé says, we're always moving through places, never into them. And I think that's so right.
How do you actually get others, so you're ready to engage in an exercise of listening, how do you get a young person to actually engage, speak, when we're all so used to 30 seconds of this, 30 seconds of that, 30 seconds of something else. Just a constant rotation to actually sit.
It's hard because I think so many young people have been trained to think that their relationships are always transactional. And listening says it's not transactional. Real listening. And I think sometimes students, they don't even know what to do with it, right? I mean, I've had students come into my office and they come in with an agenda and they expect me to answer the agenda and they're out the door. And if you say to them, we're not doing that today. I just want to know about you. And sometimes they say, I don't have time, and they run out. Because they're not used to it, and they don't know what to do with it, right? And I think that's just something that you have to know you're facing. And so for someone to feel that they are genuinely being listened to, you have to create the context in which that's clearly communicated. And it's sad to say that in so many institutional contexts, even the institution communicates that's not what it's about. And this morning there was a very good conversation that was happening about how students come prepared to build and pad a resume and to get this next certificate or something like that. So it's always just adding rather than sort of lingering and being patient and taking things slowly. And I think working with students to say, we're creating an agenda-free space here for the time being. And we'll see what happens. And that can be really nerve-wracking. And I'll be the first to say, do I do that every day? Right? And this is where it's really helpful to have people who are with you, who you've talked about this with, and they can help you. Because there's nothing like a colleague who comes along and says, hey, Wirzba, how you doing with your student engagement? Right? I mean, I wrote a book about the Sabbath years ago, partly because I had 4 kids and my life was out of control. And so I wrote the book as a way for people to say, Wirzba, how you doing on that Sabbath thing? And then I say, oh, it's terrible. Right? So, we need communities that will support us and that can inspire us and that can even correct us when we lose sight, because it's so easy to lose sight of the things that we know we should care deeply about. So having colleagues and friends, people who care about you, coming alongside of you to encourage you is I think, really, really important.
So I can see the importance of having community in that space, but I'm imagining you sitting here in your office in the Divinity School at Duke, where listening anywhere on campus is not an activity that people put a whole lot of stock in. And here, right, in many ways, it's profoundly countercultural. And you may have a colleague or two who is trying to practice deep listening as well. But everybody else, you can hear the door open and close constantly as the students, every 5 minutes are churning through. How do you push back against the broader cultural context? Because those doors are opening and closing constantly in the Duke Divinity School. And even in a divinity space, there is this transactional dimension to it. Because that's what a research university does. We're churning them out.
Yeah. It's a really hard question, Suzanne, because, as you say, our institutions don't welcome, they don't incentivize or reward it. So just recently, in the last 2 years, I've become director of research in Duke's Office of Climate and Sustainability because Duke made a commitment to address climate change, understand it, and so forth. And the idea is that this should be a whole university effort, and including the School of Medicine. So it's a huge mandate. And I said, when I accepted the role, I said, one of the most important things that will happen if my work is successful is that I will have helped create new friendships on campus. Friendships between people who would never have thought to meet each other, let alone be friends with each other, who then can work with each other about what they're doing. And I thought, hey, this is a great mission statement, right? Friendship. And then I started to try to do that. And and then these are people that I knew slightly, and some I knew better, and they said, I would love to do this. I would love to make friends, because that's far and away the best thing that's happened to me since being in academic life, is that I've been able to have friendships now with people I would never have thought it would be possible to have friendships with. Not because they're unusual people, it's just that they're in a different universe than me. But when it happens, it's absolutely fantastic. And so I would try to have convenings at Duke, and the response would often be, I don't have time, right? But when we could do it, and we would say maybe carve aside 2 full days for people to have conversation about what they care about, what they love to do, why they got into the work that they're doing in the first place. Almost without fail, they'll say, this is the best I've done in years. And they'll say, this is why I got into academic life. And why can't we do this more often? And I'll agree with them. I'll nod my head and say, yeah, these 2 days have been fabulous. And then what happens? You walk out the door, you're checking email. So I think to really make change happen, you need to have leadership who are going to say, this is important, we're going to incentivize it, and we're going to reward it. And I've taken to saying more recently, and this, I don't know if I'm saying this wisely or stupidly, but at Duke we're in significant cost reduction mode, $350 million cut in our budget. And I'm saying, this is a time for us now to figure out how do we turn toward each other, to start asking questions about who do we want to be as a university, what kinds of relationships do we need to develop to do research differently in the future, because we're not going to be able to rely on federal funding, which is the engine that drives so much research at research universities. Can we turn to each other? And the example I give is, we, over the years, have had opportunity to work with all kinds of community groups, congregations, and so forth. And they will do this amazing work in their communities. Like, just recently working with a pastor outside New Orleans who decided to develop what he calls the lighthouse. Because he saw after Hurricane Katrina, the federal government was pretty ineffective in getting a lot of things done that needed doing, and needed doing quickly. And these are mostly African American churches that he works with. And he said, we're just going to do it because we've got networks of relationships. We're going to create little solar cells that will help people, charge their phone batteries. We're going to be working on getting sure that they have blankets, that we have basic medical supplies, that we have basic food supplies, that we have in facilities, so that when trouble comes, we turn to each other. And I think, what if we could adopt some of that wisdom from people who have constantly felt that they've been left behind or abused by the federal government, because we turn to people power. And that requires relationship building, it requires friendships. And my dream is that institutions can learn from these people, because what they have to tell us, I think, is profoundly true. Right? That when we're in trouble, we really need each other more than we need a program to help us through. Not that we don't like having federal research dollars, they're great to have, but at the same time, we have to have this other dimension too.
I think here you're echoing some of the conversation from this morning, where we heard from folks in the professions about this moment for the research university and the real need to rethink the relationship between higher education and society.
Yeah.
And what is that social contract, and what should it mean moving forward? I think you have a very relational perspective of that. I really appreciate how you're thinking about how civil society has models for doing this that are very compelling, that we could bring into the university. Universities are used to spreading ideas and notions.
Oh, Duke never does that.
No, well, Duke is very special in that way. Harry has a great sense of humility.
Yes, I know.
Outstanding.
Well, so here, this is a great example, right? I have friends at the Duke Law School who run the law clinic there, which means that they have students working with communities who are, dealing with varying legal issues. And what has been remarkable to me to hear these friends tell me is that they go to a community, they've already had a relationship with the community, they've posed a research question that they're going to work on together, and then they start going into community town halls. And even community leaders will say, I didn't know that my community was thinking this. And they're saying, you know, the questions you had, yeah, they may be interesting, but you're missing out on all these other questions. And these other questions that you hadn't thought about, they're actually the more important ones. So to start doing community engagement, and then let that community engagement feed and drive and inspire and correct whatever research program you thought you were bringing to the community, it's thoroughly upending. And research projects that have been sort of circumscribed by a 2-year window end up being 4 years because they have to scrap and start again. And that's okay. But what it tells universities is that their models of doing research, their models of doing engagement, they're seriously deficient, right? And so figuring out how do you actually learn to listen to communities rather than just come with your solutions or whatever, that's an act of humility that a lot of institutions have trouble with.
I think it's also, you talked about the structures of universities, and I think many colleagues around the country who are coming up for tenure, for promotion, had federal funding, it's been withdrawn, and they can't continue their work. And so their panic is, I had 3 years to finish this project, get out a series of publications so I could be promoted, because there is this churn of expectations in a university. And so there's something profoundly countercultural that you're advocating, which is to acknowledge that commitment to community is deeply relational. It requires time. It requires a profound humility to engage over time. And it's almost as if the model of the university has developed such that those things don't fit. And how do we, you know, is it financial crisis? Is it the stress of the moment that's going to enable us to say, okay, let's blow it up and start with a different frame? How do we approach that?
Yeah, I don't know that there's one way to answer it because institutions vary, but I think, you know, just reflecting on our own context at Duke University, where one of the things that we're really trying to encourage is interdisciplinarity, right? And I think we do some things pretty well there, right? We have mechanisms and incentives to get people outside of their lane of specialization, and that's really good, and it's been one of the best things about my time at Duke, I would say. But we still have a long way to go, and we still have that problem that was talked about this morning, where you write those 6 articles that only 6 other people in the world would bother to read, so you can get tenure. And that's a problem. Another thing that has been, I think, said at Duke, and now the question is how are we going to operationalize it, is that we want to be much more of a community engagement type institution. And what I want to suggest is, well, now if we're serious about community engagement, we're serious about interdisciplinarity, we got to dramatically change tenure promotion standards. We really have to. Because if you say, we want you to do interdisciplinary work, so for instance, if we say, you know, we're going to address climate change, that means we have to develop resilience in coastal communities. That is not just an engineering problem. That's a healthcare problem, it's a food securities problem, it's an education problem, and there's just so many dimensions. And you have to bring in people then from law and policy and medicine and community organizing and anthropology and, you know, storytellers and artists. You have to bring them all together in a space where they can learn to understand each other and how they can each contribute to the work that needs to be done to rebuild a community. And that takes so much time, and young professors that I work with will say, I can't do that because it'll destroy my tenure case. And that's the warrant now to go to our provost and to go to our APT committee and say, the university is saying in public, we want to do interdisciplinarity, we want to do problem-focused research, we want to do community-engaged research. If you want those things and you say them publicly, this is what you have to now do. You know, and somebody said this morning, it would be a great idea for a person becoming full professor to have to summarize what they've done in a way that a lay audience can understand. That's a lovely idea. I would want to add to that. I would say, if you come through tenure or full professor promotion, now your job is to pick a colleague in a vastly different discipline and now start working with them and learn from each other and see what will that do to the work you're going to do in the future. Because one of the things that's so beautiful about a place like a university is that you're surrounded by really intelligent, thoughtful, often very caring people. And if we can just catalyze new kinds of relationships that are uncommon or unexpected, what will that do to the character of the work we're doing in our own research, but then also in our teaching? I think it would be really lovely.
I like that. And so I want to pivot and ask our disciplinary respondents so we can engage in an interdisciplinary conversation to each say 60 to 90 seconds. I know these folks will be brilliant in a pithy statement. Ryan, you're right in front of me.
I'm coming with a mic.
Here comes Erin. So just reflect a bit on what Norman has shared.
Thanks for the opportunity. Brian Ian Teal, Duke University, and I'm reflecting from medicine. Over the last year, Harvard physician Lisa Rosenbaum has written a series of articles in the New England Journal of Medicine analyzing the culture, the moral ecology of modern medicine. One of her pieces in particular spoke to the suspicion that Norman has highlighted. It's titled, "On Calling from Privileged Professionals to Cogs of Capitalism." In her piece, Lisa highlights the suspicion of hope that modern medical students have, as well as their suspicion of viewing the work as a calling or a vocation. Like the increase for the farmer to maximize yield, students as technicians are urged to maximize efficiency, productivity, quality improvements. In so doing, we have robbed students of purpose and of meaning. As a result, Lisa argues that medical students are quietly quitting. That is, they view the work as a job, and they're only willing to give what's required in the confines of that job. They do not have what Norman writes, a love deeply and committed wholeheartedly to the work. In his chapter, Erotic Hope, I think he beautifully outlines this sort of suspicion and what this looks like. Norman writes, "By becoming numb to themselves and their world, people slowly lose the sense that who they are and what they do really matters. The opposite of joy," Norman writes, "is not sadness, it's numbness, an erosion of the yearning for intimacy." And so he offers what he calls erotic hope. That in itself ought to encourage all of you to pick up a copy and read it.
Everybody received a copy, so.
But this erotic hope, which is not pornographic, it does not objectify or degrade. Instead, it urges us to be caught up within the flows of life we find to be beautiful and good. And so my hope for medical profession and for the students and residents I work with is that they would share a joy, a delight in the celebration of life's freshness, vitality, resilience, goodness, and beauty. That they will experience joy when they feel themselves most fully alive, actively participating in the life all around, exercising the potential that is uniquely theirs to realize. When joy is real and deep, Norman writes, it frees bodies to explore and dance. And I hope my students will be less suspicious of hope and drawn to that sort of beauty so that they can again find joy and dance in their work.
Thank you, that was beautiful. Jessica?
Thanks. My name is Jessica McManus-Warnell. I'm in the Department of Management just across campus in the College of Business here at Notre Dame. And full disclosure, I totally scrapped the comments that I was going to say today after being here all day. And just wanted to say a couple of things in reaction to some of the things that I've heard. And I did want to start with a passage from the book, which I'm really enjoying, because I don't know, I guess maybe all business faculty are pragmatists, and so one of the things I've been doing all day is like trying to find a through line, and so this quote I really liked. People who live in hope do not seek to shield themselves from the pains and problems of this life. Their love compels them to engage the trouble and work for a better future. Hope grows and its meaning is more fully discovered when love goes to work in the world. The most important matter is not that people have a fully worked out picture of what a better world looks like or have a clear sense of the exact form their actions should take. The most important thing is to act on the conviction that your community needs you and is calling you to contribute. And I thought that was really nice. And some of the things that I heard today that I really resonated with me were, to start in our plenary, Andy's comment. Sometimes I feel when we are in these kind of interdisciplinary gatherings that I feel defensive about business because this, the institution of business is a lot of the trouble that we're facing as a community, but the work of people like Andy Hoffman, another one of my heroes, Mary Gentili, who does a lot of work on business for good, inspires me and I hope can, inspire other people to think about trying to engage business not in an oppositional way, but as a partner. Our business students and my colleagues and I, teach students at every level from undergraduate to executive MBAs who have, years of professional experience. Business people are people. They're people who are also deeply troubled by some of the things that we're deeply troubled by and are talking about at this conference. And so when I think about hope, I was trying to make the connection between, they're coming to us to be inspired and to be informed. And so I think this idea of like being worthy of that. And I just hope that none of the faculty that I connect with, and I hope this for myself too, that I don't allow my concerns about the world to become such a cynicism that a feeling of cynicism that means that I am not being worthy of their trust to come to us and to think we have something to offer, and to really truly, at our heart, believe in the idea that institutions like businesses have the potential to help and to be part of the solution. So again, totally off script, and I'm not sure who's next.
Thank you.
I will also go around. Suzanne? So, yes, okay, great. Nancy Lake from Harvey Mudd College. I will also go a little bit off script and be inspired by you all and read a quote from Norman's book, so I guess we're all on theme there. I think, so the quick top of the mind thought that someone might go to with engineering is, and Guru said this morning, everyone thinks engineers are problem solvers, and we are. That is what we try to do and what we love to do, but also we create problems. And also we can be dangerous in our problem solving. Lots of people think they'll fix the climate with their geoengineering. And what I would like to think of and kind of tie to Norman's book, an idea of hope here, is what my human-centered design colleagues like to talk about, how you should fall in love with the problem, not the solution. And this doesn't mean we like problems. But what it means is we don't want to get set on our too excited about our amazing technology and not think about what is the real problem. What are we trying to solve? And so I will read to you from the introduction. And here Norman talks about good intentions are not enough. A better way is when people approach each other and their shared worlds in the gentle postures of humility and solicitude. Postures not based on a presumption that any of us knows beforehand or definitively what others need. Solicitude requires that people be willing to be with others, to listen to them, to be instructed by them, and then to discover with them what needs to be done so that mutual flourishing might be achieved. And this is what I think engineers, and maybe all of us, should really aspire to. This, as he ties to, as saying this is this name for this way of being is love, and love is the hope-producing power that guides our minds, hearts, and hands when it is activated in us.
Thank you, Nancy. Karen?
Thank you, Norman.
Is it on? Can you hear me? And I am not reading from your book. I apologize, we didn't confer. But I think that your remarks and the book itself give us so much to think about in education. I'm Karen Boland, by the way, at the Practical Wisdom Project at the Abigail Adams Institute. So we work in that third space with undergraduate and graduate students, and I work with school leaders and teachers, and also with the Human Flourishing Program as some of our research practice partnership. And I can tell you, talking to not only current students, but also many young college graduates and now young professionals who I've taught over the years, they tell stories about professors who've given them hope and who've marked their life, and it's in very small things. And so I want to speak about education broadly. We're all educators and mentors. And it is precisely that presence that you discussed, that listening. We accompany students in the messy moments when they've made a mistake or they've blown it royally in a course, on a paper, or in a project, and how we help them to see that this does not define them down, but becomes a place from which they can emerge and grow, is something they carry with them into their professional and personal lives. And similarly, when we care enough to correct without fear, to hold them to a higher expectation, to give them very specific feedback on how they can improve, it's so deeply satisfying. And these are the little things that sometimes we don't have time for, or we don't take as seriously, but when we do it with attention to that person, I know it wasn't until graduate school that I got specific feedback from professors on what I was actually good at. And it really marked my career. Of course, you're looking like, well, you're too old, you weren't raised in the self-esteem generation. But I think we are giving students in all of the, whether they're undergraduates, graduate students, so many reasons for hope, and we're catalyzing their energy, their promise and potential, helping them to see it in all the ways that we serve as mentors, guides, in this apprenticeship of becoming a professional, a person, a young adult. So our calling as educators is very profound and this, thank you for this conference, but I think your book really reminds us not to lose sight of the little things and give that gift of our presence, because we don't know how much hope we're sowing in those short encounters.
Thank you, Karen. Before we open it up, did you want to reflect on
I'd like to
reflections?
say something in direct response to that. So first, thank you, the four of you, for even taking the time to say this. This is really meaningful to me. Thank you. I tell people that my life is a total fairy tale because I'm a farm kid. I know nothing about academic life. And I go to my local university because that's just what you do if you're going to go to university. I didn't know what to study because no one in my family had higher education. And I took a history course, got to know the history professor a little bit. And then he said, you know, you ought to come eat lunch with us because we have an oversized office and we've got 4 couches in there and we eat lunch in there every day and you can sit with us. And we take an hour. And I started to go to have lunch with them, and they were like parents to me. And they said, you know, we think you can be a professor. And I said, but that's not real work. Because real work in my world meant bricklaying, construction, and farm work. That's work. And so they said, well, actually, we'll hire you to read books one summer. I said, you're kidding. You can do that? And then they were the ones who were with me all the time, telling me, you can do this, introducing me to areas of study, and then saying, now let's make a plan for graduate school, which I knew, again, nothing about. And I think about the love that these teachers had for me. It just blows me away. But it was a different culture. You know, they were still active scholars, but they believed that it was important to make time for students. And I've seen that that's just harder and harder to do. And so I often think about those teachers who were like, they weren't just mentors, they were like parents to me. Good parents. So thank you for that reflection. I think that's just so important. The question of time, again, is a big one, right?
Great, so I'd love to open it up to questions, thoughts, reflections.
I'm gonna ask Sam Dean if she could grab the microphone on that side so that we can each be looking for hands on two sides of it.
Is it on?
Thank you so much. I look forward to reading your book. I'm sorry that I haven't gotten into it yet, but I wondered, since you, I didn't know that you were Canadian, and I'm glad to hear it because another Canadian, a countryman of yours, Henry Giroux, has an article that I really love, and I teach sometimes about hope. And he talks about, and I'll just read a line from it. He says, "In my view, hope becomes a discourse of critique and social transformation. Hope makes the leap for us between critical education, which tells us what must be changed, political agency, which gives us the means to make change, and the concrete struggles through which change happens." And he's thinking very, in all of his work, very particularly about political change and hegemony and resistance and those sorts of things. And your tone, at least as I've encountered you this afternoon, is less ardently political in that way. But might you speak in more political terms, if you don't mind, in terms of how you speak with your students or your children?
Yep.
About the political reality or the fact that we are political animals, or we are called to be as in our civic lives, how it shows up in that way. So maybe this is another space,
Yeah.
Outside of the classroom, a fourth space of some kind.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have a chapter called The Politics of Hope, but I do have 2 chapters on economics and architecture. And to me, politics is woven into the heart of both of those enterprises, because how we build, whether it's homes or neighborhoods or energy grids or farming systems, whatever, those are all political decisions. And it's the same, I think, with economics, right? Every economy bespeaks a political framework, a set of political commitments. And what I do in those chapters is I talk about how, especially more recent, and by recent I mean the last 150 years, the forms of our economic and architectural life have changed dramatically. And they've changed in such a way as to serve the interests of finance rather than the interests of communities and people. And so I try to describe, first of all, what's gone wrong in architecture. And there's a variety of things that you can mention there, but then I go to an example about a community-built hospital in Rwanda that is entirely devoted to lifting up the goodness and the beauty of the region and the goodness and the beauty of the people. And built into the whole process of the construction of that hospital was participation from the community, right? So thousands of people were engaged in the building of this hospital, so that when they came to the hospital, they saw the results of their love in that building, in the design of the building, the construction of the building, the maintenance of the building. And so this is a radically democratic, participatory kind of politics, right, that is embedded within this architectural process. And this is so important because, how do you design a hospital? When you discover that the history of hospital design was around sort of sanatoriums, right? Mental health, illness institutions that locked people up, kept them from being outside, right? These are architectures that can either create spaces in which we recognize and affirm the value of life, or degrade it in their very design and material manifestation. And I say that so many young people I know, they look around the world, they just see so much ugliness. And they start to think, does the world matter if the way we design our buildings on it does not honor the life that's there, or the beauty that's implicit in things? I mean, I love making things with wood. Wood is gorgeous. And to think what we do with wood is just crazy. And so architecture becomes, I think, a fabulous way, because architecture communicates the values of a society, of a politics, in a way that so many other things do not. And and the chapter on economics, which I won't get into very much, there's a similar kind of problem there, right? Financialization of capital has dramatically altered what we understand the goals and the meaning of a life are, and it's a deeply, deeply cynical vision.
I'm going to stand because it seems like noise are coming from disembodied heads. My name is Mark Minaldo. I'm from East Texas State University. Your example on the farmer was probably one of the most compelling things I've heard in the public engagement such as this, so thank you. When I heard you speaking, however, and I'm sorry about the name I'm about to throw out, I just have like Martin Heidegger now in my head because of attunement and lingering. So question A, are you thinking of Martin Heidegger's phenomenology of care and lingering attunement in your work? And if so, how did you avoid the dark side of Martin Heidegger, which is anticipatory resoluteness is sort of an asocial mode of being?
So
And
Heidegger's
sorry
a
for
bastard,
the philosophy
right?
talk.
You all know that, right? Heidegger's a bastard. He's a horrible human being. And this is hard for me to say because I spent years reading Heidegger. I was deeply formed by his phenomenology. And so to learn to disentangle what I want to do from Heidegger is a lifelong effort. I don't like to reference Heidegger much in what I write any longer, partly because since the Black Notebooks in particular, we've learned to see how closely intertwined his National Socialism was with his philosophical orientation, right? For a long time people said the life doesn't matter. No, Heidegger made it very clear in the 30s that the life is everything in determining the value of a philosophy. I think one of the ways that I would characterize a major difference between Heidegger and myself is that Heidegger is so obsessed with death and thrownness, and I want to argue from the perspective of natality, birth, and not thrownness but givenness. And those two differences are crucial differences, because whereas his thrownness in anticipation of one's own finitude and death casts the whole philosophical enterprise within the context of anxiety and dread, which are obviously major themes in his work. And what I'm wanting to say is if you cast life instead in terms of birth and creativity, right, that dramatically changes the way you think about a human being, such that now you are not this sort of heroic individual facing an absurd world, but you are instead a conduit for the reception and the transference of gifts to others. It's a radically different way of thinking what the human being is. I mean, I won't ever lose Heidegger's, insistence that the human being is always a placed human being. But I think about the place in dramatically different ways, and the human in the place in dramatically different ways.
So my first date with my husband was a 3-hour conversation about Heidegger. Quite literally.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wow. And you're married still. Wow.
It's why I wanted to marry him. His critique of Heidegger. I was impressed.
That's amazing. I'm impressed. Newly impressed.
All right, somebody else.
Thanks a lot. I've been particularly attentive to the various points at which you've talked about young people, and we've talked about our own children too at some different points. And many of us are of the age where we have, children who are going to college or they're young adults, and you reference your own young adult children and how they're a key reference point for you in understanding hope and all of that. And I'm program officer at Lilly down in the religion division. and one of the areas in my portfolio is young people, so all things adolescents and 20-somethings. And so we've been doing lots and lots of work for better part of, well, decades, but for me, we're about a decade. And one of the programs one of the grants we have right now is running a leadership network. It's piloting a program, leadership network for 20-somethings, young Christian leaders. And the program had a gathering recently, just last month. And so they brought a whole bunch, it's at Princeton Theological Seminary, so they brought a whole bunch of 20-something young people who are in all kinds of different sectors, right? They have jobs and careers in lots of different places. And each young person came with an older adult mentor, because that makes it the transit, you're meeting strangers and so forth. So you have this sort of room, imagine this room, lots of 20-somethings, and then people, a generation older than them. And they started talking about, what's your vocation? How do you think about your life? What are you called to do? And they talked a lot about the church. And the only people in the room who were discouraged and cynical about the church were the older people. And all the 20-somethings were super excited about the church. And they talked about their own churches, and they talked about how, we could do this, or we could do that. And so the whole place was just filled with hope, but not the older people. And so as I think about younger people, it seems to me that it's a really complex picture. And we're doing all kinds of work at the endowment to try to map and understand this. They're definitely not a monolith, right? And so I just wonder about how young people bring such energy, right? And just they're not burdened, right, by what their mentors might have, might be burdened by. So so this is a really long-winded way of saying that. And I think part of what they're struggling with, and part of what we're struggling with, might be soullessness. And you're a theologian, and you said a lot of things about love, and that's great, and I appreciate everything you said. But what do you think it means to have a soul? And what do you think it means for that soul to be the wellspring of hope? Maybe particularly if you're young.
That's a doozy.
Laugh a bit, isn't it? Yeah. The first thing I want to do is I want to resist the idea that soul is an individual thing, right? So if you think historically, Socratic tradition, you have this myth, soul pre-exists the body, enters the body, animates it from within, and then takes off at the point of death. I think that's rubbish. I think if you want to talk about soul, you have to think socially and also ecologically. And the reason I'm thinking this is, you have this group of young people that come to me down to work on leadership. I've been involved for 3 years with my colleague Abdullah and Tepli, where we bring together roughly 25 to 30 young faith leaders from around the world, all different traditions, Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim, Jain, you name it. And they're amazing, because they're leaders in their communities, and we bring them to Duke for a week, and what they do is we try to give them tools to go back to their home communities so they can address climate change realities, whatever they happen to be, extreme heat, dislocation, health issues, education, whatever. And we listen to their stories. And one of the things that hits me again and again and again is how these people describe their formation in a social and an environmental context, ecological context. How so much of what they understand themselves to be doing is a continuation, an outgrowth, a kind of receiving of wisdom and insight and encouragement from where they are in the midst of tremendous trouble that they know they have to address. And part of the energy that they have, and they are amazing, what some of these people are doing in their 20s and early 30s, it's just astounding to me. What they're doing is they're not thinking, I'm doing this. They're thinking, I'm a vehicle through which so much else is enabled to pass. And so soul for me is not going to be, in the Socratic version, something that is uniquely mine. Right? I think we've misled ourselves and each other with variations on the theme of what is identity by so deeply individualizing it and atomizing it. Agency is always distributed, and soul is the power of agency, I think. And once you acknowledge how agency is a distributed phenomenon, it's always a feature of our upbringing, our relationships with other people, but also with places and creatures. That these are constantly circulating their way through us. The implications of that, once you absorb that shift in thinking from soul as individual to soul as collective or dispersed, I think it's a complete game changer. And it changes also the way we think about the work that we're going to be doing. Makes it less heroic for them.
Great.
Yeah, thank you. Ruben Rosario, St. Louis University. I wanted to go back to something you said earlier in reference mostly to the dialogue with your own children, but this idea that the younger generation in some way is blaming previous generations. I used to think that way, and I thought I'd reached a point that I couldn't reach my own kids, who my son calls what I do theology blah blah, and the students that it's my life's work to try to communicate with. And stereotypes between generations are so easy to fall into, right? And so I thought, this is the most apathetic generation I've ever encountered, because I couldn't get them talking about the environmental crisis, racism, economic injustice. I'm teaching a class in social justice, has broad appeal. I get students from every discipline. But I felt like, what's going on? That the topic should generate discussion just on its own, right? And I was flailing. And by providence or design, Pope Francis released Fratelli Tutti. This was October 2023, I think. And I decided to scrap my lesson plan and let's just dive in. It's posted on the Vatican website. Let's dive into this document together today. I hadn't read it ahead of time, but we found some choice passages. And it was a real aha moment, because in it, even though he'd written previous encyclical on environmental crisis, he said some things about the environmental crisis and its link to racism and economic injustice. And it was like a light went off for a lot of these kids. And what it was this. It's very simple. I would love your thoughts on it. They realized that here's the most together person spiritually they know, the Pope, and he's expressing frustration and impotence about the overwhelming nature of the environmental crisis. And a light went off for them. They realized, okay, if he doesn't have all the answers, then it's okay for me to feel like I feel, which is angry, impotent, but instead of feeling hopelessness, they realize, okay, he's then suggesting a way forward. Then that means then I can try to find a way forward. And it really turned my class around. And I'm just curious how that little nugget of an experience that I had, what your thoughts on it are, and maybe help me process it a bit better.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I don't know that I've got a real great answer. I think there's so many factors that could be playing into this, right? On the one hand, it could be social media where they've been talked at in these sound bites and they think that professors are just mimicking, repeating what TikTok people are saying or whatever, and that's pretty nauseating, I think. It could be that there are questions about, is the space a welcoming space? Do they feel like they're going to be genuinely heard? I mean, one of the things that I do in my class to start the semester is I talk about how we need to learn to be hospitable with each other in the class, and that's got to be a ground rule, that we're not going to jump on each other, because it's important for people to be able to say something and then say, oh, that was stupid, and come to your own realization. And we're going to learn to be merciful with each other. And sometimes it works pretty well, happens pretty quickly, sometimes it doesn't. I think sometimes there's questions about fear that people have. There can often be mental health issues that we don't know, don't anticipate. Like with my biology colleague, Emily Bernhardt, we designed a university-wide course called Let's Talk About Climate Change for Duke undergrads. And what we were not prepared for. We had sort of thought, okay, there's going to be mental health issues that we need to be attending to as we're doing the class, because Duke is a lot of international students, and so we had students who were from Pakistan while there was a major flood happening, and they're totally stressed out because they know their families are in danger, right? Or people who are living in areas where there are wildfires going on. And you know, what happened is we designed the class so that there'd be plenty of time for small group conversation, and in those small group conversations, it sometimes took students a while to come to the realization that they could say what their deepest fears were. You know, Iris Murdoch has this wonderful line where she says, when having a conversation with somebody, one of the most important things you need to figure out is what are they afraid of. And until you get to that level, you can't really have a conversation. Because it's this fear, there's the suspicion, I mean, there can be anger, there can be all kinds of things. And, you know, I think the issue of scale is really important. How big is the class? And what can you do to create a more personal environment so that people feel that there's space to speak, space where they know they'll be heard, space where they can make mistakes, where we can all make mistakes, even professors, depending on where you are. I mean, there's regional difference, right? I mean, being in the South, sort of, is different than being in the Northeast versus being in the Northwest, right? There are different cultures around educational formation that will affect what kinds of conversations will happen and how quickly they will happen, what's possible. So I think the best thing to do in a situation like this is, can we just talk about it? Can we talk about talking? What should we get?
What happened that day?
Yeah.
I left the syllabus behind.
Yeah, I mean, they can look at a syllabus and say, oh, it's all preordained. What have I got to do? I'll just sit here and soak it in, you know? And so giving flexibility to say, you're going to bring something today, and that's going to change what we do today, and that's okay. Like, that's hard, because, somebody mentioned earlier, you don't want to give up control. So yeah, I think each situation, each setting is going to be different and will present challenges and opportunities.
Before people depart, let's just take a moment to thank Norman. I think this is a wise, a loving, inspiring book, but I also think it's a real call to action for educators, but really a call to action for anybody who cares about another person or who cares about the world. So thank you for that.